One of the reasons that Jan very kindly asked me to come and speak to you today is because every time we talked about our respective trades, to say analysis and literary biography, we were struck by their similarity. For instance, they neither ever seemed to be able quite to get away from sex. More seriously, they were both about trying to understand the roots of a personality, and both almost always found them, the roots, in the past, especially in childhood. Almost always, too, what one's trying to understand by the time someone comes to an analyst or writes a book is the roots of pain. The things that I came to think and say in my book about Jean Rhys ended up being, I think, rather analytic things. For example, that in order to avoid pain, she did things like forget and deny events to cut herself off from her own history, which only created greater pain. And, which is the main theme of my book, that one of the main things she was doing in her novels was giving herself, as it were, a course of analysis, making herself face, under the mask of fiction, some of the most painful things in her life, which all had to do with her own responsibility, her own guilt. Not, I have to tell you, that this actually helped her in her life. That is indeed the rest of my thesis. In fact, it made her a great writer, but an even more wrecked human being. I hasten to add that this is, of course, where the comparison with analysis ends. Or maybe not. She should have gone to a good analyst, you may say, not tried to do it herself. But then we wouldn't have had the books. And anyway, I'm not sure. There are some pains, perhaps, some facts that nothing can cure. Well, let me tell you what I propose to do. First, I'll tell you a little bit about Jean's life, and a bit about her work, or my view of her work, and the relationship between the two. That relationship, I can tell you right away, was like a great X. Her life starting up here and going downwards, and her work starting here and soaring upwards. In other words, the work grew greater and greater, and the life sadder and sadder. That is why I call it Jean Rhys's Voyage in the Dark, after her third great novel. Then secondly, I'll tell you a bit about my own feelings and experiences in writing about her. That was, I can assure you, a voyage in the dark too. Jean was born in 1890 on the tiny West Indian island of Dominica, population 30,000, white population 300. She loved her indulgent Welsh father and hated her strict English mother and her popular younger sister. She had a strange, powerful, disturbed childhood on this vivid and desperately poor island. At 17, she was sent to England. She spent a year at the Perse School in Cambridge and a term at RADA. She was withdrawn after a term because the school said that she couldn't lose her West Indian accent, so she would never be able to act on the legitimate stage. So she immediately joined the illegitimate stage and spent a year in the chorus of a touring musical comedy. At the end of 1910, she met the great love of her life. He was twice her age, rich, well-educated, the perfect English gentleman, but underneath, not unlike her, sensitive and insecure. He fell for her, too, more than he had meant to, but he got out in the end. For 6 years after Lancelot left her, Jean plumbed the depths. She lived on an allowance that he gave her and hated him for it. She worked in a suspicious massage parlor and posed for artists. Mostly, she drank too much and took revenge on men for what Lancelot had done to her, by letting them wine and dine her and then rejecting them. At the end of the First War, she met and married a Dutch journalist. They went to Vienna, where they were rich, until John, her husband, was nearly arrested for illegal currency dealings and they had to flee. They went to Paris, where they had a son who died at 3 weeks old, and a daughter whom they were too poor to support. A rich friend paid for her to be kept in a children's clinic. Jean quarreled bitterly with this kind friend, Germaine, but Germaine always forgave her. In 1924, Jean met the famous writer Ford Madox Ford. She had always written out her great sadnesses as a child in Dominica and again after Lancelot. Now Ford saw a diary novel that she'd been keeping ever since then and recognized her great talent. He set her to writing short stories and helped her to publish them. He also fell for her, again briefly, and she for him, again desperately. Then John, her husband, was arrested for embezzlement. Her marriage broke up, then the affair broke up. She wrote her first novel, Quartet, in despair and revenge. In 1928, she returned to England to publish Quartet. She met the literary agent whom Ford had got for her, moved in with him, and married him. This second marriage lasted until her husband, Leslie Tilden Smith, died in 1945. But it was no happier than the first. Indeed, it became much unhappier. Leslie couldn't handle Jean's drinking and despair. She became violent, and she had her first encounters with the police for being drunk and disorderly. Mary Vaughan, her daughter, chose to live with her father and only visited Jean on her holidays. This loss of her daughter was one of the great sorrows of Jean's life. But Leslie, her husband, stuck it out and took care of her talent if he couldn't take care of her. During their years together, Jean wrote most of her books, actually all the rest of her novels, if we include a first draft of her last novel, White's Sea. During this time, the two axes of the X crossed each other, the work getting better and better, and Jean getting worse and worse. Now came her 25 years of disappearance. The war had killed her great novel, Good Morning Midnight. It was published in 1939, and no one wanted to read such a depressing book in wartime. After the war, she had a new book of short stories ready, but they were rejected. She went on writing, except at the very worst times. But without Leslie, she slowed down, and she couldn't publish. After his death, she met and married her third husband, Max Hamer. Max never withdrew from her, as Leslie had. He always loved her, but that didn't work either. He was as hopeless at life as she was, incompetent, naive, even crooked. So Jean became even more insecure and even more alcoholic and out of control. Between 1948 and 1950, she made 8 court appearances on charges of drunk and disorderly and assault and battery, and spent 5 days in Holloway. In 1950, Max was arrested on charges of embezzlement and spent 2 years in Maidstone jail. After that, his health was ruined and he could never work again. Their poverty deepened. They moved out of London to Cornwall and finally to Devon. In 1956, Jean was traced by an actress, Selma Vaz Diaz, who wanted to adapt Good Morning Midnight for the radio. As a result of this, she was rediscovered in 1957 and signed up by the publishers André Deutsch to write or rewrite White's Sea. Over the next 9 years, Max declined. Jean herself aged from 67 to 76, and she struggled to write her novel. Finally, in 1966, Max died, and Jean recognized that the novel was finished. It won her fame, at last, and friends, and even a bit of money. But it was too late. She was too old, too set in her angry and paranoid ways. She exploited and resented her endlessly loving and admiring supporters, as she always had. Nonetheless, they were charmed and excited by her, and she did have some comfort and some recognition in her old age. And despite all the agony and alcohol, she'd survived to nearly 90, while everyone around her dropped like flies. She herself died after a fall on May the 14th, 1979. That's 14 years ago on Friday. That was Jean's work. Her life, now her work. There are many ways in which the two interrelate. One is that only her work made her life tolerable. Another is that it made her life intolerable, representing to her everything that set her apart from other people and isolating her even more in order to do it. But the main way in which her life and work interrelate is that her work was her quest for the truth about her life, and her quest to give that truth artistic shape. In her books, she was always trying to ask Antoinette's question in White's Sea: why do such terrible things happen? Why do they happen to the heroines? Jean asks through the books. And through the heroines, why do they happen to me? Now, people's main objections to the novels, when they have objections, are always the same, that they are self-pitying, that they show the heroine as a passive, innocent victim of a cruel world, that this isn't attractive, and it isn't interesting, because it's hardly ever true. But I'm convinced that this is not a right reading, and in my book I try to show that it isn't. I try to show that Jean's answer to the question, why do these terrible things happen, changed. That people's objection, that her answer is self-pitying and self-excusing, is only really true of her first novel, Quartet, the one you'll remember written immediately after the disastrous affair with Ford Madox Ford. In Quartet, the heroine, Maria, is completely passive and a victim, and her lover, Heidler, based on Ford, is a completely evil monster. So that although Quartet is already brilliantly written and constructed, it is flawed in this self-pitying way. Heidler is too evil, and Maria is too innocent, and we don't quite believe in either, especially since we can see, as the narrator apparently doesn't see, that Maria's behavior, for example, to her husband, is pretty despicable. So a gap opens between what the novel expects us to think and feel and what we do actually think and feel. And Jean's moral failing, her inability to see anyone else's point of view, and her special pleading for her heroine, is also an artistic failure, and the objection here is well taken. However, when we get to the second novel, after leaving Mr. Mackenzie, there have been huge changes. We see its heroine, Julia, with all her faults, very clearly. And that's to say, of course, that Jean sees her and describes her very clearly in all her faults. Her extreme selfishness and manipulativeness, hardly seeing other people as real at all. Her drunkenness, her barely contained hate and violence. After leaving Mr. Mackenzie is an in-between novel, between dog and wolf, as Jean very accurately describes Julia. So although we are shown the heroine and all the hard truth about her, we are still expected to sympathize with her against the world. So once again, a gap does open between the book's expectations and our reactions, but far less this time, because there's far less self-pity and far more self-knowledge. Now the third novel, Voyage in the Dark, regresses, so to speak, to a wholly innocent and abused heroine, Anna. But this time it works, for the story is told in the first person, so we know it's just Anna's point of view. And we know her as a child, and she never gets any older than 20. So we understand why she's so childlike and passive, and we sympathize with that. And the man in the novel, based on Jean's great love, Lancelot, is not a monster. He's just a cautious, limited Englishman. This is Jean's first attempt at seeing the man's point of view, which will culminate in White Sargasso Sea. So Voyage in the Dark is also a moral as well as an artistic step forward. The fourth novel, Good Morning Midnight, is Jean's masterpiece of self-knowledge, and perhaps her masterpiece altogether. It's the completion of what she began in After Leaving Mr. Mackenzie, as Wide Sargasso Sea is the completion of Voyage in the Dark. For we see Sasha, its heroine, even more mercilessly than Julia. She's old and drunk and absurd. And she too sees other people, only in terms of her own needs. But this time, her own need is for revenge. She is motivelessly cruel to the young gigolo, taking her revenge on him for what other men have done to her. And by doing that, she loses her last chance, possibly, of love. It is all her doing and her own fault. We do sympathize with Sasha because she never asks us to. Good Morning Midnight, I think, is one of the least self-pitying books ever written. Finally, Wide Sargasso Sea is also a great humane achievement, as I've already suggested. Again, the heroine, Antoinette, is childlike and passive, like Anna, but again we know why, because we met her as a child. And again the man has a point of view. Jean actually gives him a whole part to tell, part two. And he, Rochester, is actually very similar to Antoinette. He's a rejected child, he's afraid to trust, he's self-protective and paranoid. So there is pity for Antoinette, but there's also pity for her destroyer. So this is my main thesis then about Jean Rhys's Voyage in the Dark, that she found the world full of hatred, cruelty, and exploitation. that she first located this all outside her heroine, directed by a cruel world onto her as innocent victim. But that with each novel she forced herself to recognize more and more that others, even men, were victims too, and that the hatred, cruelty, and exploitation were also in her heroine, directed by her onto others. Well, I have other theses in the book too. For example, that the Jean Rhys heroine can never actually take her revenge on the man who has wronged her, only indirectly, on some substitute or in dream. And whenever she tries, even in these indirect ways, it is only she herself who suffers and dies. And that this dramatizes the powerlessness of the dependent person, the slave who cannot turn on the oppressor because he or she is too dependent on the oppressor, needs the oppressor in order to survive. But this is the main one, I think, that under the mask of fiction, Jean forced herself, with enormous courage, to go on a deep and dark voyage from self-pity to self-blame. That was the easy part. That was Jean. Now comes the hard part, me. After all that, I hardly dare think what you're wondering about me. If that was Jean Rhys's voyage in the dark, what was mine? Why did I choose her? Am I like her? I know I don't think I look very dangerous, but then Jean didn't either. Well, I will try and answer some of these questions, or at least I'll think about them. I won't answer all of them, I think. Some of them I won't even ask. But I expect you might, or perhaps Jan will. Well, we'll see. What drew me, then, to Jean Rhys in the first place? Was it perhaps precisely all the trouble, all the agony? My new subject, too, is a terribly difficult one from that point of view, for Primo Levi was, of course, a great and detailed witness of some of the most appalling suffering of our century. Am I attracted to trouble and suffering? And if so, for good motives or bad? One kind reader suggested the first. She wrote and thanked me for being willing to face suffering and report on it, as both Jean and Primo Levi did. But of course, though I do hope that this may be an effect of my books about them, I had no such noble motive when I began writing about Jean. So was it an ignoble motive then? Voyeuristic or sensationalist? Like some journalists, perhaps, and I think journalists have to ask themselves the same question. Was I just lusting for a good story? Well, I have to say that it was a good story. No one was ever bored by Jean, and I wasn't either. People often ask me if I was depressed working on her for so long, and I tell them truthfully that I was not depressed, not for 1 minute. Never. Her writing and her life were both far too dangerous and frightening and exciting to be depressing. I have also said often since that I don't think I'll ever have such a wonderful subject again, in the sense of such an extraordinary and fascinating story. So, yes, oh dear, I have to admit, there was an element of that. But I remember Iris Murdoch being asked why novels and the news, shades of Martin Lewis, were always about tragedy and trouble. Because that makes a story, she said. No trouble, no story. And that's surely true. If nothing goes wrong, there's nowhere to go. You're already there. And that's why it's not just sensationalist and voyeurist to be interested in things going wrong. Someone who lived a serene and blameless life without an ounce of error or effort would be incredibly dull. He or she would have nothing to teach us at all. And that's why they'd be dull. So I won't apologize for being interested in trouble. And perhaps to an audience of Jungian analysts, I don't have to. But actually, that wasn't my motive either. I didn't know half the drama of Jean's life before I began working on her. And I've stayed away from the terrible central drama of Primo Levi's experience, the Holocaust, as long as I could, until now. No, with both of them, it was a simple and inexplicable thing. I simply fell in love with them when I read their books. Now, perhaps that sounds fanciful, but it's as close as I can come to the feeling. Certainly writing about Jean was like a love affair or a marriage in my life, a 15-year or more marriage, living with her every day. I suppose that all the most important things of life are like falling in love, including falling in love itself, completely irrational, a leap of faith, committing yourself way beyond what would be strictly reasonable. Starting a job or a marriage or a child, I mean, how do we ever dare to do any of these things? Just to cross the road, you have to have unjustifiable faith that you're going to get to the other side. So in 1975, I fell in love with Jean Rhys, and I pursued her and kept faith with her for the next 15 years. There is no rational explanation of this, I don't think. No rational explanation would be enough to keep you at it. Only passion, obsession, fascination will do it. But Jean always did inspire these things in people. She also maddened them and battered them and wore them out. But the fascination never stopped, and it was that way for me. Of course, they were fascinated by Jean in life, and I was fascinated through the books, though I did also meet her once, but that's another story. Now, I mean this quite precisely. I wasn't just fascinated by the books, I was fascinated by the person behind the books. Now, this was partly to do with Jean. Her writing is so direct and personal that everyone who reads the books responds to them equally directly and personally. They either love or hate, are thrilled or infuriated, not just by the heroines, but by her. She kept very few fan letters for her earlier books. I think that she would have got them, but she would have lost them, I suppose, on her travels. But there were many for her last novel among her papers when she died, and most of them were staggeringly personal. People telling her their own troubles, or wanting to meet her, or even to come and take care of her. And perhaps this personal reaction was partly me. Maybe I'm just a born biographer who always imagines and wonders about the writer behind the book, instead of doing what she's meant to do by the writer, which is read the damn book. But I don't really think it's just this, that it's just Jean or just me. I think that one of the great things about reading is that it is like a conversation. It's like meeting another mind, and occasionally a wonderful, interesting, brilliant mind whom you would never have met in the ordinary course of your life. I recently read this beautiful exchange between a band writer and a woman in Ivan Klima's My Golden Trades. Can you tell me something about literature? She asks. What do you want to know? He replies. What does it mean? It's an encounter. Who with? With another person, the one who wrote the book. Exactly. That's the reason and the justification for writing biography for me. Just as when you're in love with someone, you want to know all about them right back to childhood. Every detail about them is precious and interesting to you. So it is with the person you've met in his or her books. It isn't reasonable. Perhaps it has dubious aspects. Aspects of wanting to invade or own the person, as alas, we often do want to do when we are in love. Perhaps wanting to write and read biographies of writers is like going through our lover's pockets. Or, and here the simile gets quite close, too close for comfort, like reading his or her letters or diaries. Well, I plead guilty to that. Love isn't a nice, clean, altogether good thing like toothpaste. Nothing more important than toothpaste is. Loving someone ought to be wanting what they want rather than what we want, and it ought to be freeing them instead of imprisoning them, but of course it mostly isn't. And given what we are, separate beings in separate bodies, I don't even think it should be or can be. If someone wants to free me, it's not because he really loves me, but because he really doesn't. That's my experience anyway. So, if biography is a love affair, it's not altogether good and nice, but it is natural, irresistible, and among the best things that can ever happen to you. To you, the lover, the biographer, or the reader. Not necessarily, of course, to the beloved. Being loved is always a burden, they say, although, again, that's not my experience. But it's true that what people want to give you when they love you is not always what you want. In fact, it's usually what they want. So women give men what women want, like fidelity, and men give women what men want, like elusiveness, and it's all a complete disaster. But that's another story. But at least biographies should realize that it is love. that inspires biography, and not sometimes, as they sometimes imagine, the opposite. They may not want to be loved, but they shouldn't think that it is usually prurience or nosiness or a desire to bring them down and demonstrate feet of clay. Of course, it sometimes is, but almost never about writers. They're not powerful enough to make it worthwhile. Nobody would write or read about writers if it weren't out of love for their work, for their minds, for, as I said, their conversation. Of course, feet of clay usually come into it because they're usually there. Almost all biographers today, I would say all biographers today, feel that there is no point in writing a biography if it's a deliberate cover-up or lie. And I share that view. But love, you may say? Where's the love in Andrew Motion's Philip Larkin, or Margaret Forster's Daphne du Maurier, or Humphrey Carpenter's Britain, exposing the poor things as variously inverts and pornographers, a bigot, a bad mother, and a paedophile? Or, to bring it home, where's the love in my exposing Jean as an alcoholic, a paranoiac, a regular attacker of husbands, lovers, friends, and neighbors? But it is love. The more I found out what a tormented, destructive, and self-destructive person Jean was, the more my wonder and admiration at her self-transcendence grew. And that is what I described in my biography, not just a drunk or a madwoman, but someone who should have been just a drunk or a madwoman, but who, through her literary genius and her dedication to it, transcended them to become greater than herself, and greater, I feel, than all of us who have less to overcome, but less to overcome it with. She did one of the things that great artists do. She traveled further than the rest of us can or dare, and reported back to us. Left the comfortable cave of civilized life, where, however, there are only shadows of the vast joys and terrors and questions of our existence, and went out and faced the real things. We shouldn't be surprised that Philip Larkin or Benjamin Britten or even Daphne du Maurier were riven with embarrassing, unacceptable, dreadful burdens and sins. They wouldn't have written or composed otherwise, and we wouldn't read them or listen to their music. Well, as analysts, or even as non-analysts, you'll have realized what I'm doing. I'm defending myself when nobody has accused me of anything. In other words, I feel guilty. And that is true. I told you how I came to write about Jean. I fell in love with her. And now I'll tell you a bit about my feelings in writing about her, and that means starting with guilt. And that reminds me of something, which, let me tell you, is a sort of introduction. After the book had been published, I had the great pleasure of being awarded a prize for it. As Jan said, the Writers Guild Prize for Nonfiction. Well, we went along to receive our prizes, and all the people who gave out the prizes were celebrities, all much more famous than the writers, of course, and they all made much longer speeches than the writers did. But one of them made a very funny speech in which he made a running gag out of our prizes not being called Writers Guild, but Writers Guilt. And everybody laughed merrily, all the playwrights and novelists and film script writers and so on. And I, as the biographer, laughed merrily as well. But I thought, Writer's Guilt, that's me. Well, I felt guilty writing about Jean because I knew she didn't want to be written about. She had told me so. She told everyone so. She even put it in her will. Yet here I was writing a biography. Now, how could I justify that? It is, of course, quite a common problem. Lots of people, especially writers, try to put an embargo on biographies and get biographies anyway. Auden, Eliot, Orwell, to name just a few. I think first there's a general answer to this. It has to do with how long the subject has been dead, and how much one still owes to him or her, therefore, the duties that one owes to a living human being. The closer one is to the life of the person, the more that person is still a living human being in the world, with a family and friends, with the capacity to be hurt themselves, one still feels, and certainly for their friends and family to be hurt. The further in time this recedes, the further the problem recedes, until it more or less vanishes altogether. It's like using people's eyes or hearts or kidneys after they're dead to help the living. The difference being, of course, that we still quite rightly have to have the dead person's permission in the form of a donor card or at least their family's permission. But that's, of course, because in the physical case, the whole thing has to happen extremely close to the death of the person. Now, when they were alive, writers offered us not their bodies, but their minds. And I think that that is a kind of donor card for the rest of their minds after they're completely, which is to say, long dead. Now, as long as they're alive, taking bits of them that they haven't offered to us would be an insult in both medical and moral senses, and would kill them. But after they're dead, it's the opposite. It is a way of keeping them alive. Not just their work, but them. I think the reason that Jean Rhys and Auden and Eliot and the others didn't want biographies is because they only thought of them being read by everyone they knew just after their deaths. Just as though, being gossiped by your friends the moment you leave the room. If they'd thought of them instead, the biographies, as being still read by people 200 years after their deaths, I think they'd have felt differently. Michael Holroyd puts this very nicely. To write or read about a living person is to treat them as though they were dead, but to write or read about a dead person is to treat them as though they were living. Now, with Jean, of course, there was a particular problem about biography. I think that she didn't want her biography to be written because the central thesis of my biography about her is true, that she was in life a kind of failure, a kind of monster, and knew it, that the whole journey of her art was to tell the truth about this under the mask of fiction, but that she could never even begin this journey without the mask, when she put her pen down and was left with her real self, face to face with real people. So she both felt that she had done it all, told the whole truth herself, which indeed she had done, and at the same time that nobody knew it was all true of her. And she didn't want them to know it. Because she longed to be loved, as we all do, and she was afraid that if we knew the whole truth about her, she wouldn't be loved, but would instead be hated. Now, this happened to her in life, when she became, as she almost always did in the end, unable to keep up the beautifully mannered, quiet surface of the person that she longed to be, and when she got drunk or something went wrong and she made a scene. It happened in her books, when she forced herself to expose her secret self in her heroines, her huge need, her rejection and hurt, her isolation and anger, and people were shocked at them and hated them, in the 1930s calling them prostitutes, sordid and degraded, and still today calling them passive, self-pitying, depressing, infuriating, why can't they get a job, and all that sort of thing. And it does happen to her again, I know, sometimes with my book. Some readers do have this response. They're so shocked at the facts of her drinking, her violence, her inability to bring up her daughter, her exploitation of her friends, that they are disillusioned. They hate her. Sometimes they even say that they will never be able to read her books again. Now, whenever I read or hear this response, I feel dreadfully guilty. Because I know, and I say in my book, that these are just the things that Jean most feared, to be judged, condemned, and hated. And also the things that her literary executor most feared, that people might be turned away from her books instead of towards them by a biography. But first of all, I have to say that this is such a limited, even a silly response. I can't help feeling that anybody who has it has missed the whole point of my book. That is the point about Jean's self-transcendence, which I made to you earlier on. They can't have read my book properly, I think. Probably they skipped the literary chapters. And if they go still further and say that I have spoiled Jean's books for them, then I feel that they can't have read her books properly either. They have stopped on the surface of her work and the weakest part of it, the part which suggests that the heroine is always and only an innocent victim of a cruel world. Sadly, this trap catches precisely some of Jean's most enthusiastic readers, people to whom she is a hero. Some feminists, some of those who identify with her psychological suffering and isolation. But to me, she is a very tough heroine indeed, not an easy one. She doesn't invite us simply to celebrate or lament our martyrdom as women or as any other sort of outcast, but to explore it unself-sparingly, to see not only the cruelty of the powerful, but also the manipulativeness, the anger, and the desire for revenge of the powerless. But of course, one of the central things about Jean Rhys, as I see her, was that she was split between, among other things, Jean the writer and Jean the woman. She always said that she would rather not have been a writer at all, but only, as she put it, a happy woman. It was unhappiness that made her write, she said, and then writing made her more unhappy, more isolated, still less belonging. Now by this I think she meant that it was precisely her despair at her monstrosity, at her failure as a human being, which forced her to write, to find out why she failed. She would far rather not have failed, have been an ordinarily decent woman, and not have had to go on this long and painful odyssey of writing. Because of this, she associated her unhappiness, her exclusion, with her writing. She did also know that she was a good writer, and that this, as she put it, earned her death. But she really didn't think that art was more important than life. She only wrote because she couldn't make a success of life, and she wrote about not making a success of life. Now here, therefore, the question of my guilt returns. For the effect of my book, and the accurate effect of it, is to make her more loved as a writer than as a woman, and perhaps only loved as a writer and not as a woman, because I find all her personal as well as her artistic achievements in her writing. Now this would disappoint her. It would upset her deeply to be hated or condemned as a woman, and not console her at all to be loved as a writer, even if that includes, as I mean it to include, being loved as a woman writing, not just for her art, but for her self-transcendence in it. Well, here I can no longer escape my biographer's guilt. All I can say in my defense is this, that after having read everything by or about her, after having talked to every surviving friend and relation, and with every skepticism about the reliability of witnesses and the impossibility of ever knowing a final truth about anyone, I do believe that this is as close to such a truth as anyone could come to about Jean Rhys. That she was, to her own despair, a misfit, even a monster, in life, who earned the right to love only in her art. And further, that it was her tragedy in life that she could not accept this. That it was not enough for her, not the right thing for her, to be loved for her art. She longed to be loved as a person, and so she tried and pretended to be the kind of person who could be loved. But she just wasn't. She wanted to be loved for being sweet and beautiful and innocent. But she wasn't. Well, if you desire something impossible, you cannot have it. And what I hope and believe is that whatever being dead means, it at least means that you no longer make the common mistakes of life, like desiring the impossible. And that it means that you have escaped all the other distortions and limitations of individuality too. That, in other words, Jean has escaped the prison of herself, as she longed to do, and that wherever she is now, she can therefore accept and be satisfied by love for what she was, rather than love for what she wanted to be. Now, looking back on what I've talked about so far, love and guilt, I suddenly thought, my God, what Jean Rhys-like subjects. So I will have to come at last to this question that have been trying to avoid, which is, at the end now, am I like Jean Rhys? Is that why I chose her? Now one certainly does wonder this about other literary biographers. And one does guess, avoidance, a certain amount of identification often. For example, it's rather noticeable that women tend to write about women and men about men, especially men about men. Our great male biographers, Richard Ellman, Michael Holroyd, Richard Holmes, for example, have all written only about men. The women start with women. For example, Victoria Glendinning with Vita Sackville-West, Claire Tomalin with Mary Wollstonecraft, Hilary Spurling with Ivy Compton-Burnett. But Victoria Glendinning and Hilary Spurling, at any rate, have both moved on to men, Trollope and Paul Scott. Victoria Glendinning says that she was quite nervous about this to start with, but that as she began, the nervousness disappeared. In their essentials, she says, men and women, especially when they're writers, aren't so different after all. Well, I can only hope that that's true as I embark on Primo Levi. But apart from gender, do literary biographers pick kindred souls? Well, they pick other writers, for a start. And, for example, Andrew Motion is a poet and a jazz lover, like Philip Larkin, though not a bigot, I hasten to add. Claire Tomalin's subjects, Mary Wollstonecraft, Catherine Mansfield, and Ellen Ternan, all explore aspects of femininity and freedom. Richard Holmes's, Shelley, Coleridge, Robert Louis Stevenson are all romantics, like himself. But I can't see anything in common between Hilary Spurling's Ivy Compton Burnett and Paul Scott. And Michael Holroyd says that he chooses subjects very different from himself, that he likes to explore foreign lives, as a traveller explores foreign countries. Despite writing biographies of Lytton Strachey, Augustus John, and Bernard Shaw, he says, I can reveal, unbearded. Well, I thought that I was unbearded with Jean Rhys. It was very clear to me that I was in all important respects her opposite. She was mad, bad, drunk, and dangerous to know, whereas I hardly drink at all, and I'm no more than averagely neurotic. On the Iris Murdoch principle, it's pretty obvious that I'm going to have to write about her. She was a pure artist, intuitive, unconscious, mysterious, whereas I'm an intellectual, completely without instinct, having to work out everything rationally. She was totally self-absorbed and could write only about herself, whereas I wrote about her too, so proving that I'm her opposite, outward rather than inward looking. Of course, I saw that there were some connections, external perhaps, but important ones. We were both exiles, foreigners in England, foreigners even in childhood. Jean, a white girl on a black island. I, the daughter of Austrian refugees, born in England, growing up in Canada. We were both social outsiders, too. Jean because she could never fit in anywhere. I because I was unmarried and bringing a child up on my own. And, God knows, we were both poor, although my poverty was never a patch on Jean's. Now, this is what I thought all the way through writing the book. Only afterwards something curious happened. I began to notice and even remember things which during the writing I had forgotten. For instance, I had thought that I had always wanted to be a writer. Indeed, my childhood friends all remembered that I had. But my son's father didn't remember. He didn't know that. I had to remember that for a long time, I too had wanted to be only a happy woman. And what was Jean Rhys's idea of a happy woman? It was embarrassing, pre-feminist, the ewig weibliche, a mysterious, scented, take me, take care of me, goddess and siren, never a real, live, responsible human being. Now surely this had nothing to do with me, who'd always been a tomboy, had never learned, alas, to use the makeup and the beautiful clothes and the hats that were Jean's obsessions. And then I remembered the women of my childhood, at least as I had seen them. Middle European, exotic, beautiful, in fact, mysterious, scented, take me, take care of me, sirens and goddesses. So it was my idea of a happy woman, too. And I had always thought it just as impossible for me to be as Jean had. The only difference was that she, with her usual refusal to accept reality, kept on trying. Now, there was a good deal more like this, most of it equally shameful, but I will tell you just one more thing, because it may interest you. One of the most intriguing new things that I discovered about Jean during my research was that she had had a sister who had been born the year before her, and who had died before she was born, just before she was born, or just after. Now, I had taken a sort of case history of Jean around to various analysts, some of whom are in this room, outlining the facts of her life and behavior. They had all come up with much the same diagnosis, and several of them had come up with the same response to this business of the dead sister. This could be important, they said. It was quite common, in cases like Jean's, to have had what they called a mourning mother. If, when you were an infant, your mother was mourning for another child, things could go wrong in just the way they seemed to have gone wrong between Jean and her mother. Now, I've told you that I'm no more than normally neurotic, and in fact I've always got on particularly well with my mother. But when I had safely finished the book, I suddenly remembered something that I had known all my life, but somehow had never thought of for 4.5 years. I had been a twin, and my twin had died at birth. My mother hadn't mourned, she told me, because she hadn't known she was carrying twins. She never saw my sister. She never knew that she had existed until she was already dead. This was England during the war. Things weren't easy, and she was in fact rather relieved. But then, of course, she felt guilty. I'm sure that she did grieve, and perhaps grieved too that she didn't grieve. So perhaps I had just enough of a mourning mother to want to write about Jean, and yet to be able to do so. And I don't know whether you think this is possible. I'd be interested in your view. The main subjects to conclude that I find in Jean's books are not innocence and self-pity, but guilt and self-blame, and powerlessness, anger, and the fear of rejection. Now, I wonder now, of course, whether these are also my subjects. I don't know. And while I was writing the book, it never occurred to me. I think that it couldn't occur to me, that I had to be as unconscious as Jean was of what I was doing. For in a way, of course, and however different we were, what I said that she was doing in her books, I was also doing in my books, in my book about her. All biographers do it in their books. We also explore ourselves behind the mask, not of fiction, but of biography. Not primarily, and not in every way, but in some. But that is what we all do in literature, in reading as well as in writing. We explore ourselves as well as others, and therefore the similarities and connections between us, despite the differences. That is, I think, the great function of literature, both of writing it and of reading it, to extend our imaginative understanding of ourselves, of others, and of the links between us. Jean was doing mostly the first. I was doing mostly the second, but I hope we were both also doing the third. Thank you.